Now let's take a look at the spinal nerves. The spinal cord communicates with the rest of the body by way of these spinal nerves. A nerve is a cord-like organ. It's composed of numerous nerve fibers, so many axons that are bound together by connective tissue. Most nerves are mixed nerves. They contain both afferent or sensory information as well as efferent motor information. Each nerve is composed of thousands of fibers carrying currents, sometimes in opposite directions. The nerves of the peripheral nervous system are ensheathed within Schwann cells. Remember, the Schwann cells form a neurolemma and often a myelin sheath around the axon. External to the neurolemma, each fiber is surrounded by a basal lamina, and then a thin sleeve of connective tissue or endoneurium. Remember, endo means inside, so here we have myelinated nerve fibers surrounded by this basement membrane, which we can't see in this picture, and then an endoneurium around it. Each nerve is then put in a bundle or fascicle, very similar to what we saw in muscle tissue. These fascicles are bundles of nerve fibers. They are wrapped in another membrane that's called perineurium. Peri as in around, neurium the nerve. And many bundles of fascicles are then held together by an epineurium. The epineurium bundles many fascicles and constitutes the whole nerve. Blood vessels penetrate these connective tissue coverings in order to supply the nerves, which have a very high metabolic rate and need for plentiful nutrient supply. Now, we can classify nerve fibers in a number of different ways. We have sensory nerves, motor nerves, and mixed nerves. Again, to review, the sensory nerves carry signals for sensory receptors into the central nervous system. The motor or efferent nerves carry signals to the muscles and glands. Now, a way I remember afferent and efferent, you can take it or leave it, is that A comes before E in the alphabet. And in order to have some motor output, you need to have some motor input. So A comes before E. Afferent must be sensory. Efferent must be motor. Both sensory and motor fibers can also be described as somatic or visceral, depending on which organs they innervate, and general or special, depending whether it's general senses or special senses, like your eyes and sense of balance. This table here will help you see how the classification of nerve fibers can be thought about. Now, a ganglion is a cluster of neurosomas or cell bodies that we find outside of the central nervous system. Inside the central nervous system, it's called a nuclei. Now, this bundle of cell bodies might project off the side of the nerves, and it allows communications between a number of different neurons. Among the neurosomas are bundles of nerve fibers that lead into and out of the ganglion. The posterior root ganglion is associated with the spinal nerves on the posterior side. This is where the cell bodies of sensory neurons can be found right before the neuron enters the dorsal horn. So there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves. Each of them are mixed nerves. There are 8 cervical pairs from C1 to C8 that begins between the skull and the atlas. The others exit through all the different intervertebral foramen. Remember when we looked at the arrangement of the spinal column? There are 12 thoracic spinal nerves, T1 to T12. There are 5 lumbar spinal nerves, 5 sacral lumbar nerves, and 1 coccygeal spinal nerve. These numbers correlate fairly well to the numbers of vertebrae. Now, let's look a little more closely at what happens with these spinal nerves. So when we put it inside the vertebrae, Here is our spinal cord with the gray matter in the middle and white matter surrounding it in various columns or fasciculi that ascend or descend the spinal cord. We can see the dorsal root, which is the narrower portion, and the dorsal root will come together with the ventral root to form a spinal nerve. Again, the dorsal root is sensory input, otherwise known as the posterior root. We'll notice there's a posterior or dorsal root ganglion. There are 6 to 8 little rootlets that could enter the posterior horn of the cord. So as you'll see, when the dorsal root enters the dorsal horn in the spinal cord, it'll split into several different rootlets. So now let's look a little further away. When we get out through the intervertebral foramen as a spinal nerve, what happens? This nerve will fork a number of different times. We call these the distal branches. You can most clearly see these branches in the figure below. The anterior ramus will innervate the anterior and lateral skin and muscles of the trunk. It'll have several other forks, but we'll just worry about this one right now. The posterior ramus will go into the backside of the body and innervate the muscles and joints in the region of the spine and skin of the back. Then we'll see a meningeal branch. This re-enters the vertebral canal and innervates the meninges, or the coverings of the spinal cord, as well as the vertebrae and spinal ligaments. This dissection shows clearly the little rootlets that split off from the dorsal horn as the spinal nerve enters the spinal cord. So take a moment here to diagram the various forks and branches that arise as spinal nerves. You can include the dorsal and ventral root, the portion that's actually called the spinal nerve, the anterior and posterior rami. And now we'll start looking at even further branches in each of the different regions of the spinal cord. Each of the anterior rami will branch and anastomose, that is, reconnect with other branches repeatedly to form these 5 different nerve plexuses. There's a cervical plexus in the neck. It's relatively small, only C1 to C5. It supplies the phrenic nerve to the diaphragm. The brachial plexus is near the shoulder, C5 to T1, and it supplies the upper limb and some of the shoulder and neck. One of the notable nerves here is the median nerve because it's involved in carpal tunnel syndrome. The lumbar plexus is found in the lower back, L1 to L4. It supplies the abdominal wall, the anterior thigh, as well as the genitalia. And then the sacral plexus is L4, 5, and S1 to S4. It supplies the remainder of the lower trunk and lower limb. The coccygeal plexus we'll see in S4, S5, and then coccygeal vertebrae 0. You can see these different regions and different plexuses here in this figure. Now let's take a closer look at each of the plexuses. The spinal nerve roots that give rise to each plexus are indicated in violet in each table. Some of these roots will give rise to smaller branches called trunks, anterior divisions, posterior divisions, and cords. Each of these you'll find color-coded and explained in the individual tables. I don't want you to get too wrapped up in what each of these anastomoses do. See, this is an anastomoses. We've come from spinal nerve C3 and C2. We've had a couple of different branches. And then they anastomose, rejoin another nerve. Let's look at the brachial plexus. It's a little bit more complicated. Here are the spinal nerves in violet, and the spinal nerves may come together to form trunks. The trunks may then split into anterior and posterior divisions, and they may rejoin to form cords. So in general, it'd be nice to know what the cascade of joinings and rejoinings are called. However, you won't need to know that this is the lateral cord, the posterior cord, and the medial cord. But you can see here that the brachial plexus leads to some fairly important nerves that you'll need to know. You'll explore these in Anatomy and Physiology Revealed. But the median nerve and the radial nerve are very important nerve. The ulnar nerve, we see the median nerve again in the forearm. And again, the radial nerve. Here's a dissection of the brachial plexus. You'll see this in Anatomy and Physiology Revealed, but you'll only need to know this as the brachial plexus. Now we look at the lumbar plexus. It arises from these lumbar vertebrae. You should know where each of the plexuses arise and which regions they supply, and probably some of the major nerves that arise from the plexus. So here you can see the roots, the spinal nerves from which the lumbar plexus arises. When we look in the actual skeleton here, we'll notice that in orange here, we see what comes from the lumbar plexus. The main nerve that you'll need to know is this femoral nerve. There are other nerves involved here that arise from the sacral plexus. We'll explore those soon. As we look at the sacral and coccygeal plexus, we can see the roots from which they arise. When we look back at this figure, we can see some important nerves. The sciatic nerve and the tibial nerve are particularly important. The radial nerve and sciatic nerves are especially vulnerable to injury. Number of different problems can arise. So I'll leave you to explore these on your own. Perhaps you'd like to highlight one of them for your presentation at the end of the semester. Shingles is another disease, or chickenpox. All of these are a variety of the herpes virus. Another great possible topic. Each spinal nerve, except for cervical 1, receives sensory input from a specific area of the skin called a dermatome. A dermatome map is a diagram of the cutaneous regions innervated by each spinal nerve. Such a map is oversimplified, however, because the dermatomes overlap in their edges as much as 50%. Therefore, severance of one sensory nerve root does not entirely deaden sensation from a dermatome. It's really necessary to sever or anesthetize 3 successive spinal nerves to produce a total loss of sensation of one dermatome. Spinal nerve damage is assessed by testing the dermatomes with pinpricks and noting areas in which the patient has no sensation. People have been caught being untruthful about the nature of their injury based on their response to dermatome mapping. Maybe someone wants to take a look into that. Tell us some really interesting stuff. So that brings us to the end of this section. We've got one more section in this chapter, and that's to look at the various reflexes and their patterns.